Welcome to Think Inclusion Podcast. We're an inclusion podcast with a difference, where we share real stories from real people so that you, the listener, can hear and learn about other people's experiences of both inclusion and exclusion. Ultimately, here we're talking openly about how we all want to feel like we belong. I'm Garry Clarke-Strange, founder of Think Inclusion Consulting, and on today's episode, I meet with Clare Radford, who shares her experiences of returning to work from maternity leave and talks openly about why she feels companies need to focus on getting this right. It's a fantastic episode that I know you're going to enjoy, so let's go with episode 1 of Think Inclusion Podcast. Hello and welcome to Think Inclusion Podcast, the podcast with me, Garry Clarke-Strange, as your host, and a whole heap of guests who are coming to share their stories of their own personal life experiences with us to enable us all to learn a little bit more about other people's experiences. I am joined today by the wonderful Clare Radford, who I had the pleasure of working with during my career and is now a trusted friend. Clare is going to talk about her own experiences, which we'll explain in a bit. But firstly, Clare, welcome to Think Inclusion Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And also, you're our first guest. So big for me to have you. And thank you for agreeing to be the first guest on this podcast. The podcast is about sharing stories. Because one of the biggest things that I find in the work that I do in inclusion, diversity and equity is that fear holds people back. And one of the ways to remove fear or help people overcome fear is to understand more about people's different experiences. And there's loads of different ways to do that, but there's nothing better than hearing it from the person direct who has that lived or living experience. So that's the premise of what Think Inclusion Podcast is about. Can you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are. Tell us a bit about you to get us started.
Yeah, definitely. I'm Clare. Thank you for having me. I'm a business psychologist by background, a Brummie, born and bred. I've got 2 children, Emmeline and Finn, married to Kian. I enjoy making cakes. I have 2 cats. I love a bit of craft and drinking down the pub with friends. And of course, love chatting with you, Garry, about the businesses that we both set up in the last 12 months.
And I've tasted your cakes on many occasions, and I can say they are amazing. Talk to us about your career, Clare. Where has your journey been to get you to where you are today?
Yeah, so as I said, I'm a business psychologist by background. I started off in-house at a big company called Jaguar Land Rover, supporting them with culture change and development. I then went into various consultancies and moved abroad to China for a year with one of those organisations, which was fascinating. I then moved back to the UK and worked for a leadership development consultancy before I went in-house as head of talent and leadership development at Greene King, which is where we met and worked together. And then 12 months ago, I decided it was time to create something for myself. So I created And Culture Consulting. And that's been, a year of amazing experiences, challenges, and a lot of fun along the way.
Fab. And it was an inspiration for me to see you create that business as I was starting my journey as well. And we had a lot of fun working together at Greene King, right?
We did.
And Clare had to listen to a lot of me talking about inclusion diversity because it's what I do and what I'm passionate about. But Clare, in your own words, what does inclusion diversity mean to you? And can you think about a time when you might have felt like you really belonged somewhere?
Oh, yeah. I suppose what it really means to me is really valuing everyone for their differences.
Yeah.
But not really just what makes them, stronger as an individual, but also some of the gaps and the weak points as well. So a time when I've really experienced that was the team that we worked in together. What was really unique and wonderful was that we just accepted and valued each other despite some of the weaknesses that we brought to the team. So the example that comes to mind is that role for me was the first time I was ever given a budget to manage. And I had no clue how to manage a budget or how to even read a P&L. And it was about a year into the role that I finally asked our leader, could you explain this to me? Like, how do you read a P&L and how do I manage a budget? And she just laughed. And then whenever we did budgeting together, that was kind of a shared joke that I wasn't great at it, but some of you were. And I really liked that approach that we kind of celebrated what made us different and we complemented each other, and it was okay. It felt so safe to kind of put your hand up and say, look, I'm not good at this, or I think differently about this. And to me, that was a really good example of inclusion.
Oh, it is. It's that psychological safety to be able to say, like, I'm not. This is not my strong point.
Yeah.
And we all have them, but we have got strong points as well. But it's then, it's one of the things about what I think makes a great team work is when you can work together. But I get it. Like, it definitely, that team was one where we could really just be ourselves and actually be quite fragile with each other about
Yeah.
those things. I love that. That's a really great start to the conversation. And we're going to talk today about a topic that I think is really, really important. And I mean, it's obviously very important to you because it's part of what you do with your work now. But when we look at the experiences of a lot of people in the workplace, returning to work after parental leave is something that affects such a high proportion of the current workforce. But yet, I don't think we talk about it in the same way that we talk about other areas of inclusion. It's just, I think it's growing, but also it's one of the areas that I just don't think there's enough awareness of. That's going to be the theme of today, and we're going to talk about your experiences. Are you ready to share them?
I'm ready. Yeah.
So you talked at the start. You've got two kids. Um, do you want to talk about, I guess, the different experiences that you had with them? Should we start with your first experience of maternity and how that experience of returning to work went for you?
Yeah, definitely. And first of all, just say, I think you're absolutely right. This is something that I don't see many organisations and individuals really leaning into. So thank you for bringing this to your podcast as the first topic. I think, like many people, my experience of maternity leave was not straightforward. It was a real shock becoming a mom from one day to the next. And my daughter was born with a few physical difficulties, which are now fully resolved. But she had hip dysplasia, hypertonia, reflux, and that meant that my mat leave was not entirely straightforward. It was quite stressful.
I can
It
imagine.
induced a bit of anxiety in myself. And I think what that meant was that I felt even more nervous about returning back to work because I'd been plunged into a world that was just so different and so difficult to navigate for me. So prior to going off on mat leave, I was very, very ambitious, kind of high performing, high anxiety individual, always wanted to do well. My career was really important. So I knew that returning back to work was inevitable for me and I really wanted it to go well. I had 12 months off with Emmy and I actually, looked forward to returning to work. But as the date got closer, I started to feel real high levels of anxiety. And I think it was leaning back into the unknown, having been out of the workforce for a whole year, perhaps doubting my abilities to reintegrate as well. But
All
I
the
agreed with
general
my
elements of anxiety, right, coming back into play.
Exactly, yeah. And really focused on that one day, that day of returning to work. And it was sort of looming large over me. I'd agreed with my manager when it would be. And the organisation I was working with had moved to this beautiful modern office not far from London. And this was pre-COVID, so we were all still expected to be in the office. And it was a 2.5 hour commute for me at
Remember
the
those
time.
days?
So, yeah, I remember those days, dreadful. So it took quite a lot of planning. I had to get childcare in place. I had to have a plan B in case baby was ill because I was too far away to get back in time. Put all these plans in place, jumped in the car that morning and set off to return to work. So this day was a really big deal for me and I can't underemphasize that fact. I arrived at this big modern office, and went and found somewhere to sit on my own, ready to have a return to work conversation with my manager. So 9 a.m. comes and goes. I'm kind of trying to remember my password and what I'm meant to be doing. And they hadn't turned up. 11 a.m. comes and goes, still no sign of my line manager. And I think it got to about 2 o'clock when I finally received a message to say, really sorry, forgot that today was your first day back in the office. So can we rearrange? And it was so casual and so sort of dismissive that I realised in that moment, oh my God, this day that has been such a big deal for me has not even registered on his radar of
Wow.
stuff that's happening that week.
Yeah.
So I just felt really stupid. I felt like, oh my God, I have built this up so much and made such an effort to come and be here and be present. And it was all for nothing. I'd ended up sitting on my own, achieving nothing that day. I felt forgotten, I felt invisible, and I went back to my car and had a little cry and then drove the 2.5 hours home. And it was at that moment that I realised, gosh, I'm feeling quite vulnerable, and the organisation has not supported me in the right way during that very vulnerable time.
The word you used there was I felt stupid. Like that's hard to hear because I'm picturing you in that scenario where you've kind of been forgotten and all the anxiety, and you've got yourself to London, which you know that should be a celebration in itself to get there on day one and get there by. I know you said 9 o'clock. I'm like, how did you get there by 9 when you're got a child to sort that morning? It really annoys me that you were made to feel like stupid in that scenario.
Yeah. And I did come to that feeling of sort of being angry a little bit later on down the time.
Okay.
I think I was in such a place of low confidence. I assumed that it was my own fault. I was looking inwards rather than outwards. But I did eventually feel quite angry and quite let down.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, because I guess it's interesting. Because people aren't talking about this, so this is your only experience of it is what you're living, and no one else is talking about the challenges that it goes. Like, I don't have children. I'm sitting listening to this story, going, "Oh my God! Like, how do you even get there as someone who doesn't have children? I can't imagine how it felt that day." Yeah. So we're not going to go into detail of what the reality after that day was. That was, I guess, your first experience. But did things improve at all? How was your experience back further than day one?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I suppose after that point, I almost had my awareness was really alert for signs that I was suddenly not important anymore. And I
Okay.
had definitely felt that some of my treatment before going off and having children was quite different. I was given high profile projects, put on a development program to become a director. And a lot of that stuff did seem to fall away a little bit. And instead, conversations were more about, oh, there's a project near the West Midlands, maybe that would be better for you. And we want to really think about what's right for you now you've got a family. And so I was made very aware of the fact that,
Yeah.
I'd changed as a person and the way I was treated also shifted. I expect probably with the right intentions, but it just wasn't always executed well. But the
And
thing
that's
I
it.
did notice after is the treatment of other people when they came back from mat leave as
Okay.
well.
Because
It's
of
something
your
I'd never
experience.
noticed. Yeah. Because I'd never been through it, I just, my radar wasn't switched on to those individuals. But because I'd had that experience, I then started to notice similar things happening,
Yeah.
particularly to other women around me.
And we talk about intent and impact a lot in this space, and I'm sure nobody intended, personally to make you feel like that, but the actions they did, because they were understanding how you were feeling, will have, had that impact on you that made you feel like that. It didn't put you off. You had another child. You mentioned at the start you have two. So how did pregnancy two go? Did you learn anything from that experience, and what was the return to work like for that?
Yeah, so I guess pregnancy number two was very different. A large part of it occurred during COVID.
Okay.
I was still working at the same organisation during that time, but I suppose I'd learned to, really hold some boundaries in place, look after myself. And I had decided that, I actually wanted to exit that organisation at some point, in
Yeah.
part due to that treatment, but other things as well. So I had little Finn during COVID, which was a very, very tricky time
I can
for
imagine.
anybody to bring a new baby into the world. There were no support groups, play clubs. It was quite a lonely place. And I had moved roles during my maternity leave. So decided to have a slightly shorter amount of time off. I returned back to a new job, a new team, new organisation after just 6 months. So Finn was a lot smaller than Emmy, still a little tiny baby in a lot of ways. And my experience of returning to work was very different. I no longer had the doubts about myself and my ability. I knew that that would all come back with time.
Good.
I was joining a new organisation, so there were a different set of challenges. But one thing that I did experience, which was a real challenge for me, were some of the comparisons that I received from other senior females in the business. So, one lady in particular, who was quite a senior individual, would say things to me like, well, I went back to the boardroom 2 weeks after having my children, and I was answering emails right up until midnight and breastfeeding at the same time. And there seemed to be a lot of comparisons, which again, intent versus impact.
Yeah.
Perhaps she hadn't intended it, but it made me feel like, oh, I'm not doing a great job of this. Perhaps she's seeing something in me that
And you're
doesn't
new
match
to
her
role.
expectations.
You're new in a company, like on top of the normal anxiety that you have, that's going to be even bigger, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think my reflection was, I'm sure for lots of men and women, maybe 20 years ago, maybe more recently, there probably were different expectations, and things for women certainly were very challenging if you wanted to have a child and a career. So my sense was there was almost like, I'm going to pay it forward. I had a really difficult time, and now you're going to have a really difficult time too. And
Yeah.
that really triggered my anxiety again. Went through a period where I invested in some CBT, which I'd really recommend if anybody listening does have, challenges around anxiety. And it came to a head where I decided to actually hand in my notice at that organisation because I couldn't find a way through balancing my life as a mom to two children, but also wanting to show up as my best and do my best in work as well, when there was a lot of this judgment and conversation directed at me from some senior female leaders.
It just the word that's in my head as you're saying that is toxic. Like that is just even making those comments to you like that. That's what their experience was. We all have our own individual experience, but kind of as you say, paying that forward or portraying that onto somebody else, that's quite toxic behavior, and it's not a good leadership trait. And I wasn't there, right? But I can't imagine how that will make you feel.
Yeah, yeah, and I think when you're in it again, my tendency is to turn inwards and kind of
Okay,
question: Is this because I'm not doing a good enough
your
job?
fault.
Is my fault?
Yeah,
And it kind of came to a head. It was coming up to Christmas. I'd been in role for 9 months, working really hard on one of the most complicated projects of my life, and I'd booked some time off to spend with the family. And again, this senior female leader kind of said to me in a throwaway comment, okay, enjoy your time off, but I am going to need you to join a project call at 9 a.m. every day during your annual leave. And I kind of went, oh, okay, thinking, like I really wanted to have this time off, but okay, that's the expectation. And again, because I turned it inwards, I accepted that. And it was only when I went home and spoke to my husband that he was like, absolutely not. That is not acceptable. And he is a senior leader himself, and he kind of reflected, I would never ask anyone to do that. That is
no.
not okay. And that's the point at which I realised I'm not doing myself any favours here by letting her walk all over me. And it was time to really hold some boundaries.
I mean, like without children, I'm still would not be happy about having to join a project call on my annual leave when I worked in a corporate organization, because annual leave is there for a reason. It's part of a well-being. We need that time to switch off from the day to day. But then adding the anxiety that I'm hearing around returning back and kind of, I, I guess what's interesting here is although very different experiences, there's negative parts of both these experiences, and that's I guess the challenge here. So you stack all that on top of each other, and you go something like that being asked to return to go on a call every day when you're on leave.
Anyone who's got children knows that that is really difficult. I find it really hard to have my working brain switched on when my children are around me, because
Yeah,
particularly when they're little, they need so much of your time and positive attention. I couldn't possibly have managed a project update whilst, having them around. And I wanted to spend time with them. That's a really important part of my life is being really present and interacting with the children in a positive way. So it just was never going to work.
No, it doesn't sound like it would. And like it's really interesting. I identify as male. I was listening to a podcast yesterday actually, and there was a lot of talk around kind of mum guilt, but also the expectations on females versus males in the workplace returning from parental leave. But we have talked here about your personal experience as a female in a straight cisgender relationship. What do you think about the impact on other genders or same-sex couples and that? Is it the same? Is it different? What's your view on that?
Well, I have actually spoken to lots of males, either in, traditional heterosexual relationships or same-sex relationships, and I think that it's just as difficult for them. Fighting to have enough time off when you've got a new child is a real challenge, and I think because our societal norms are that's the woman's role. Maybe sometimes that feels a bit easier, although we have lots of other challenges as females. And I did speak to one same-sex father relationship where they were adopting a child, and they had a real battle to get adoption leave from their employer. And in the end, one of them ended up leaving their job and took time off with the child that way. And I'd say, in those circumstances where a child is being adopted into a family, it can be even more important to have someone around and that stability to welcome them, make them feel a part of the family. So although it's not my experience, I have no doubt that the challenges still exist for males as well.
And it's only going to continue to grow, right? So if we think about the change in the workforce, the change in population, this is, I hear a lot. We both worked in HR functions before, so we hear about the fight for talent and reducing turnover, etc. This is an obvious, I guess, bit of an own goal for organizations not to be focusing on, because this is going to start to impact more and more people. I can only talk about my own experience of being a gay male. Again, don't have children, but I'm going to a point where I now know other people in my friendship circle that have children. That wasn't on my radar 20 years ago. It wasn't kind of a thing, but that's growing, and that's only going to continue to grow. So therefore, the amount of people in the working population is going to have these experiences more and more and more.
Yeah. And I don't think the systems or educational policies are in place yet in most organisations to support that. So that's where I feel we are lagging behind quite a lot in making the workplace an inclusive environment for all working parents.
And that's why I love to work with you, because you don't let these things go. So, I'm all about doing exactly this. It's creating a place for everybody to belong. But I know particularly in your case, you kind of took this experience as part of, then you kind of set up your own organization. You've done some research into that, which I've had a sneak peek at, luckily. And I think it's fascinating. But talk to us a bit about what your research has been part of and what that's told you.
Yeah. Well, I suppose since my experience many years ago, I have just had a real curiosity about what other people experience when they go back to work. And so when I set up Culture Consulting, I embarked on a piece of research, unpaid, just independent research, to gather as many stories and experiences as I could. And I've been so fortunate now to speak with over 400 individuals from the UK about their experiences of returning to work. And unfortunately, there are some incredibly difficult stories in there. And I've been brought to tears listening to the experiences of some of these individuals. And predominantly, it's because the cultures they work in, the line managers they work for, are just not educated and not empathetic about the experiences they're going through. And unfortunately, it means that businesses are losing out on serious talent. They are leaving in their droves. And all the research tells us that having family-friendly policies and practices is getting more and more important. So what I really want to do now is raise awareness of the research, speak to organisations about how they treat their staff who are returning from parental leave, and just try and give a few pointers around how to make the experience a better one for everybody involved.
I mean, the fact that you've got research of 400 people already, that's a huge start, to get that. And I guess now that I'm hearing your story more, I'm probably not so surprised that there are similar stories out there. But, I, as someone who's been a leader myself, because I don't have my own experience of that, I'd find it very hard to then talk about or know what to do in these scenarios other than my own kind of common sense view. So I guess that kind of lack of insight for people who might not have those own personal experiences is a real gap in leadership, right?
Yeah. And I mean, don't forget that most leaders, the majority of leaders, never receive any formal training in how to run a team or manage people,
Yeah.
let alone how to support those that are going through something as life changing as having children. So, again, the intention, I believe, is not necessarily to create difficulties. And often the conversations I had with individuals was about very well-intentioned managers accidentally putting their foot in it or doing the wrong things. So I do think that the best approach is to come to this with a real open heart and open mind and just educate, let people know what some of the frequent challenges are that new parents are going to have. I was reading somewhere that the level of sleep deprivation that new parents have is like being completely drunk in the workplace. So, just even acknowledging that your staff member is really tired and is going to struggle making decisions, I think could go a really long way to improving their experiences. I think the thing that really came through for me in the research was the dehumanization of these parents that are coming back to work. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. There
Yeah.
was a lady I spoke to who was constantly referred to as the one who's always on that leave. People did not use her name or her job title. That was how they described her in the workplace. Shocking.
Yeah.
And then another individual told me that they were briefed upon their return to absolutely not talk about their child, not acknowledge that they'd been off to have a child, not talk about them, not share pictures, because it wasn't acceptable in their culture. They didn't believe that their other staff members would benefit from hearing about this part of her life, but she was very welcome to talk about her pets.
Talk about bring your whole self to work. You can talk about 30% of your home life or your being, but you can talk about a really important part, which is your children.
Yeah, yeah. And I genuinely believe that becoming a parent is nothing short of transformational in terms of the development that you get. It shows you how to have a growth mindset, how to be flexible, patient, empathetic, how to plan your time better. And I tell you what, you give a project to a working parent, they have not got time to piss about. They're going to get stuff done and
You're
be
gonna get it
efficient.
done.
So I think we forget all the real positives that being a parent in the workplace can really bring. And we just tend to remember that, the negatives, that when the kid is off, yes, that parent might have to leave work early and go and pick them up. But that's life, unfortunately.
But I think the empathy that then brings, especially if they're a leader or even as a colleague, as a teammate to other people, regardless of whether it's the same experiences or not, that's a different, it is a way of thinking. I guess that's the whole point, as we mentioned at the start about this podcast, is, some of the stories that you're going to hear from other people, like what you've heard in your research, like, those two examples, although we went through them quite quickly, they won't leave you, right, once you've heard it. You just think, how could that have been that is what happens to people, and same with your experiences. And that's the whole premise of understanding other people's experiences. But what's important for me with this whole topic is that we take something away from it, so people don't just think, oh, I heard that story, wasn't that, I don't want to use the word sad because that's not the word I'm trying to convey, but that was that was a shocking story to hear that Claire
Yeah.
shared. Well, so what? Actually, what's going to change as a result of that? And I love what you're doing with your business now, is that you've actually got a bit of a framework to take away from that you're sharing with organizations, because you're always such an overachiever, Claire. This is typical you. Take your experience and help other people. I guess briefly before we finish off, talk to us about your framework that you've built and what it is you are enabling companies to do now.
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing to say is that there doesn't need to be a really expensive or complicated solution to this. There are a few simple things that individuals and organizations can do to make this experience better. The first and the most critical is line manager education. Get some working parents to talk to leaders in your organization about their experience. Show
Share the
them this
story.
podcast. Share the stories and help them to understand how they can best support and be curious about their staff members' experience.
Yeah.
The second thing is networks. Networks are so important, and just finding and connecting with other working parents is one of the ways that the individuals I spoke to really navigated their return with success. So again, sharing stories, hints and tips, emotional support, really important. The third thing is a really good flexible working policy. But as you well know, it's not enough to just have the policy. You've got to help people understand how to access it, how to use it appropriately, when and how it can be flexed and applied. So you've really got to lean into and think about that. And then the final thing I would consider for the individuals who are returning to work is, how do you feel about upholding boundaries and advocating for yourself? Because for all the people that I spoke to, they might have worked in a toxic culture, they might have had a bad manager, but if they were able to articulate their own needs and advocate for themselves, they were more likely to have a positive return to work. So I would really invest in some of those skills for yourself, just to make sure that you can be clear on what it is you need.
Is it like that last part really stands out in my head as you're talking, because it's not confidence building, because that's not what this is, but it's just giving people the platform to be open about where they're currently at or what they still want to do, because they shouldn't become this forgotten colleague just because they've been off on parental leave or their home life has changed and things are changing. You need to give them the platform, right?
Absolutely. And I often joke when I talk to businesses about this that, your ambition doesn't fall out with your placenta when you have a baby. Like, for lots of people, that ambition is still there, and it might be different, but you still need to articulate that and support that.
You've just given the best ending to the podcast I could have asked for with that last statement. I mean, let's just take that as the highlight of the takeaway. That, but
You're welcome.
thank you for doing that. It's true. It is totally true. And these things do change, but you're still the same person, or you're still the same driven person. And Claire, we will add in the show notes, we'll add the instructions of how to get in touch with you, because I know personally how passionate you are about this area from your own experiences, but also to improve the experiences of others. And thank you for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Garry.
What a great conversation. Big thanks to Claire for joining me on episode 1 and sharing her experiences. This podcast is all about sharing stories to help us all learn and appreciate others more. So I hope that you took a lot away from Claire's story today. Remember, if you would like to share your story here in order to help others learn more, then get in touch. And if your business is looking for support in making inclusion a reality, then check out our website at www.thinkinclusionconsulting.com. Watch out for episode 2 coming soon.